Thank you very much for having me. There's really no need to thank me. Simply I was doing my job through the whole Essendon saga, and I think a lot of people who are not Essendon supporters think that I'm just black and red through and through, that I've been an Essendon supporter all of my life. The truth is, I don't support any team in the AFL. In fact, I don't support any team anywhere because it makes it far too difficult to be able to do my job. And all I've tried to do was stand on the outside and look in and try to untangle some of the threads that led to this very big mess. As we know, when it comes to anti-doping, it's a rather opaque system. Basically, if you play a sport that receives government funding in a country like Australia, and pretty much all sports do, then the sport has to be a signatory to the WADA code, or the World Anti-Doping Code. Once you're a player contracted to a sport, you hand over your rights to be able to have any challenges heard in an environment of your choosing or with the legal support of your choosing. Quite simply, you hand over your rights to have everything heard in the Court of Arbitration for Sport, and the only representation you can have are by those who have been registered or accredited by the Court of Arbitration for Sport. So it's a little bit like journalists as well. If they want to cover a particular sport, they have to apply to get their accreditation, and the governing bodies have sole discretion to say yes or no based on things that are not terribly transparent. As Kim mentioned, we're going to hear from Kristen Worley a little later. She's been able to actually challenge the IOC's gender policy only because she refused to sign a player contract. So she actually gave up her cycling career because she didn't want to hand over her rights to the Court of Arbitration for Sport. It's an interesting and quite complicated story, which we'll hear a little bit later. Last weekend on The Ticket, which is a program I do with the ABC, we had a US barrister, David Larkin, who some of you may know about, and he was talking about the current FIFA trials in the New York Federal Court. And he basically said that, you know, this is equally applicable, not just for FIFA, but for all sport, that the governance model in sport is designed to protect one party, and that party is the administration. And unless that system is changed, then it doesn't matter how many people you get rid of, because the new people coming in are still operating under the same system. And so that is really what needs to be looked at most closely. But there is some incredible work being done by organisations like the World Players Association here in this country, bodies that are aligned to that, such as the AAA, the Australian Athletes Alliance, and the AFLPA, the Rugby League PA, the Australian Cricketers Association. All of them are doing work to try and push for change in this regard. Which leads us to our first presentation tonight. Brendan Schwab is the Executive Director of the World Players Association. That's the umbrella body for sports unions worldwide, representing tens of thousands of athletes across a multitude of sports in about 60 different countries. He's been instrumental in actually gaining changes within FIFA for football players. He's the co-founder and formerly led the AAA here in Australia. He also co-founded the Professional Footballers Association, the PFA, back in 1993, which is where I first met him. So let's hear Brendan's presentation.
Thank you, and I'd like to thank the University of Melbourne and of course our MC, Tracey Holmes, for the opportunity to speak to you today on sports integrity and athletes' rights, and my focus will be the global perspective. I'd like to also acknowledge Tracey's tremendous work as a journalist in recent times in really bringing to the fore the complexities and the human aspects associated with the issue of integrity of sport. The World Players Association brings together some 85,000 athletes through more than 100 player associations in more than 60 countries. As you would appreciate, one of the common issues that unites us is the importance of making sure that sport upholds integrity, but does so in a manner which is in keeping with the fundamental rights of the players who belong to our unions. I acknowledge that the Essendon case has prompted today's symposium. It highlights many of the challenges in achieving an anti-doping system that upholds the human rights of athletes. It also demonstrates the power of international sporting organisations to make law, especially the International Olympic Committee and its related organisations, the World Anti-Doping Agency, or WADA, and the Court of Arbitration for Sport, which I'll refer to as it's known as CAS throughout this presentation. There are major global forces at play in the world of sport, and my presentation will draw to your attention the players' belief in the need for there to be two fundamental reforms. The first is the reformation of world sports law, or Lex Sportiva as it's known, and the second is the reformation of the governance of sport at the global level, especially sports institutions of justice and sports institutions of integrity. The starting point is, what do the players want? And I would like to quote the late Executive Director of the Major League Baseball Players Association, Mike Weiner. In 2011, he spoke as follows: "The players are determined to do all they can to continually improve the sport's joint drug agreement. Players want a program that is tough, scientifically accurate, backed by the latest proven scientific methods, and fair." And he went on to say that in the case of the joint drug agreement between Major League Baseball and its Players Association, that he believes that their recent changes of that time firmly supported the players' desires while protecting their legal rights. I don't think anyone could say more succinctly what our position is in terms of global sports integrity. A system that's tough, backed by good science, but it's also legally fair. As we can see from slide 4 of the presentation, the Essendon case played out publicly in many ways as a dispute between the Australian Sports Anti-Doping Authority and the players at the Essendon Football Club. The players signed a contract of employment which was bound by and incorporated the laws of Victoria. And they, of course, agreed to play professionally an Indigenous game solely administered in Australia. The laws of Victorian employment applied. There was an employment relationship. The players had a duty to obey the reasonable directions of the club. The employer was obliged to provide the staff, equipment, uniforms, medical equipment and treatment. The employer had a duty of care to provide a safe workplace. The laws of natural justice and procedural fairness applied, and any contract under Victorian law cannot impose on the player as a worker or as a professional any unreasonable restraint of trade. The contract, of course, also expressly incorporates the WADA Code, and with that the legal and the political institutional framework of international sports law. WADA was established in 1999 as a Swiss foundation. It's domiciled in Montreal, Canada. WADA, under the statutes that found it, is described as a partnership between the Lausanne-based International Olympic Committee, or the Olympic movement, and the public authorities, the governments, that also participate in WADA. The World Anti-Doping Code gives effect to two international conventions. The first, promulgated by the Council of Europe in 1989, the second by UNESCO in 2005, both institutions based in Paris and France. Disputes and appeals are heard by the CAS, which was established by the IOC and is based also in Lausanne, Switzerland. In hearing those disputes and appeals, primary consideration is given to the regulations promulgated by the relevant sports authority. How is it then that world sport can impose its will over the national law of Australia so that this matter is almost governed exclusively by the WADA Code? For players, this is a practical legal reality not confined to doping. The two major bodies of casework at the CAS are doping matters, not surprisingly, and also football labour disputes, particularly disputes heard under the FIFA regulations for the status and transfer of players. One of the world's leading academics on sports law is Antoine Duval, and he describes the dominant position of the CAS in the following terms. Thanks to the accommodating stance of Swiss arbitration law towards the use of transnational private rules in international arbitration, the CAS is in practice disregarding national law when adjudicating on disputes based on the FIFA regulations for the status and transfer of players. Consequently, those regulations are very much the only source of law applying to disputes linked with international transfers and contracts of football players. And de Waal goes on to describe it as follows. In the absence of international rules imposed conjointly by national states, the football world has developed, in the shadow of the Bosman case and Swiss arbitration law, a specific global law without the state. This is all made possible because of the use of compulsory arbitration clauses in the contracts signed by athletes. Quite simply put, athletes must agree to arbitration being referred to the CAS as a condition of their participation, of course in sports which are exclusively governed by the International Sporting Organisation. In the case of the Essendon players, it was also a requirement of the Australian government. Compulsory arbitration clauses are set out in clause 13.2.1 of the WADA Code. It provides that any decision involving an international athlete may be appealed exclusively to CAS. And R58 of the Code of Sports-Related Arbitration of the CAS provides that the arbitration panel shall decide the dispute according to the applicable regulations and subsidiarily to the rules of law chosen by the parties. Accordingly, we have a situation whereby the rules made by the sporting body can prevail and in fact as a matter of practice do prevail over national law. How is this fair for athletes? CAS of course is put forward as an independent arbitrator, but if we look at its governing body, the International Council of Arbitration for Sport, it is largely dominated by the Olympic movement. This body is made up of 20 individuals, 4 are nominated by the international federations, 4 by the National Olympic Committees, 4 others by the IOC, and then there are 4 nominated by those 12 individuals, quote, after appropriate consultation with a view to safeguarding the interests of the athletes, unquote. And then a further 4 are nominated by those 16 nominees. As a consequence, the athlete's voice in the governance of international arbitration is small indeed. Last year, FIFPro supported German speed skater Claudia Pechstein's heroic legal challenge to an anti-doping violation imposed upon her. She sought to challenge under German competition law the compulsory requirement that she submit her case to the CAS on 2 grounds. The first was that it was a misuse of market position, and secondly that the lack of athlete input through the ICAS, the International Council for the Arbitration of Sport, meant that the arbitration panel was not equal, and that was in breach of the New York Convention. The German Supreme Court dismissed Pechstein's challenge and she is now pursuing relief on constitutional grounds. The ruling is controversial. I don't have time to deal with it now, but as a matter of policy, I can certainly say that we continue to press the 2 fundamental concerns put forward by her in her legal challenge. Like the ICAS, WADA too is dominated by the Olympic movement. The WADA governance is presently being reviewed, not surprisingly, in response to the crisis that we've seen emerging in the sport of athletics and in relation to the mandated doping program implemented in Russia. The WADA board is made up 50%, the foundation board, 50% of the public authorities, 50% of the Olympic movement. Its executive board is a smaller group, and any involvement of the WADA Athletes Committee is subject to the fact that that committee is appointed by the WADA president in consultation with the WADA Director General. This structure has prompted Dick Pound himself to comment in 2015 in his first report into the Russian situation that, quote, actual and potential conflicts of interest at the WADA Executive Committee and Foundation Board make decisive actions regarding code compliance unnecessarily difficult to achieve, unquote. Of the 85,000 or so players that belong to our member associations, almost 80,000 of them are subject to the WADA Code, but as I mentioned, have no input into its content. These concerns prompted the World Players Association to issue a statement of concern with anti-doping policy in April 2016. Firstly, that statement identifies that world anti-doping policy is a combination of being both ineffective as well as being unfair and disproportionate. We've also asserted the right to collectively bargain anti-doping as a health and safety and disciplinary matter, and the major concerns raised by the player associations include the need for athlete representatives to be chosen by the players themselves, the need for sound and independent governance, reliable and transparent science, a focus on catching cheats and systemic dopers rather than the innocent having to prove their innocence, often with great difficulty and with a lack of success, the need to embed the human rights of players, tough yet proportionate penalties, the need to adapt for the particular requirements of professional team sports, deal separately with substances of addiction and abuse, reformation of the arbitration system, and the need for the effectiveness of the anti-doping movement to be transparently and objectively measured. This calls for the two fundamental reforms that I mentioned in the introduction to this presentation. The first is the reformation of world sports law, and the second is the reformation of the governance of world sport, especially as its institutions of integrity and the starting point for this is international sporting organisations, which are now major businesses, to accept and appreciate their responsibilities under the United Nations guiding principles on human rights. That requires governments to protect human rights, businesses to respect them, and where that does not occur, for the affected person to be able to access an effective remedy. The World Players Association has reduced the UNGPs, as they're known, into what we call the World Player Rights Policy. That asks the sporting bodies to do 4 things to comply with the UNGPs. First of all, adopt a binding player rights policy. Secondly, identify risks through a due diligence process, and where risks to the human rights of players have been identified, act quickly to mitigate them. Thirdly, where necessary, provide players with access to a remedy where their human rights have been violated. And finally, engage in an ongoing process of player engagement, including transparent communication and accounting for the human rights record of the sporting organisation. The reformation of the governance of sport must address sports institutions of integrity and justice, as I've mentioned. Sport cannot continue to proclaim its autonomy and exceptional nature. Earlier this year, the World Players Association developed a reform proposal for the governance of WADA, which we've communicated to WADA as part of its ongoing governance review. It's based on 4 fundamental pillars, and it incorporates universal requirements of governance such as democracy and the separation of powers. The first is that the WADA Foundation Board, the equal partnership between the Olympic movement and the public authorities, should be abolished and replaced with the WADA Congress, which would be an equal and tripartite partnership between the athletes, the Olympic movement and the public authorities. This Congress would then allow the WADA Board to be reconstituted, its executive board I should say, so that it is fully independent. This independent board would be then accountable to all of the stakeholders, including the athletes. Thirdly, we need to establish a completely independent judiciary and arbitration process. I think the AFL case with the Essendon players highlighted the perceived conflict of interest with the AFL Anti-Doping Tribunal. I think it did so unfairly. But justice must not only be done, as the old cliche says, it must be seen to be done. And that allowed WADA to come in over the top with a complete rehearing before the CAS in the circumstances I described earlier. And fourthly, we must embed the human rights of the athletes, only in relation to those which are internationally recognised. But those rights do include, for example, the right to the presumption of innocence when charged. The need to reform the CAS in relation to its human rights record has already been recognised. In April 2016, Professor John Ruggie of Harvard University, the architect of the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, in a very important report to FIFA, called upon FIFA to review its existing dispute resolution system to ensure that it does not lead in practice to a lack of access to effective remedy for human rights harms. FIFA should ensure that its own dispute resolution bodies have adequate human rights expertise and procedures to address human rights claims, and urge member associations, confederations and indeed the Court of Arbitration for Sport to do the same. To put it simply, we need to move to a situation that where there's a conflict between sporting regulations and human rights requirements, that human rights requirements prevail. The question that remains is whether sport can reform itself. I would like to leave you with a lesson from our work in relation to human rights. The Mega Sporting Events Platform for Human Rights is presently meeting and as a multi-stakeholder initiative has committed itself to embedding human rights in sport. It includes some of the sporting organisations we've discussed today, including FIFA and the IOC. It includes major brands such as Adidas and Coke, the US and Swiss governments, major UN bodies such as the ILO and the UN Office for Human Rights. We also involve, of course, the representatives of the affected groups, the unions, Human Rights Watch, UNICEF and others. There's a consensus now that there must be an independent centre for human rights and sport, and we hope to be able to reach an agreement on that with all of these stakeholders in coming months. When we look at WADA and the CAS, the question is who governs the governors, especially sports institutions of integrity and justice. The first essential step is to move to a multi-stakeholder structure, as we've recommended, that includes and involves accountability to key stakeholders, including the athletes. These are the very people who are bound by the laws and decisions of these institutions and whose lives and livelihoods are so profoundly affected by them. I'd like to thank you for your attention. I will be available for some Q&A on Skype, and I trust that the rest of the symposium is a great success. Thank you.
So Brendan Schwab really is quite brilliant with all the work he does and all the work he continues to do. And one of the words that he used quite frequently was independence. It's a word you hear a lot in sport. It's a word without meaning currently in sport.